Hello, folks. I'm Sage Latora, and today I'm honored to have the authors of Heroes Feast, the official Dungeons and Dragons Cookbook, here to talk about their book. Heroes Feast includes 80 recipes from snacks and cocktails to main dishes and desserts, all based on fictional dishes and cultures from the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons. The authors are some of the foremost experts on the history and impact of D&D, and they're here to talk with us. We have Kyle Newman, who is a writer and director. His work includes Fanboys and the music video for Taylor Swift's Style. He produced the acclaimed documentary Raiders, the story of the greatest fan film ever made. Michael Witwer is a New York Times best-selling author known for his work on the history of Dungeons and Dragons, including Empire of Imagination, which is a biography of Gary Gygax and the history of the creation of D&D. And Jon Peterson is widely recognized as an authority on the history of games, especially the origins of role-playing games, as covered in his book Playing at the World, and further explored in his new book, The Elusive Shift. Kyle, Michael, and John are all Diana Jones Award nominees for Dungeons & Dragons Arts and Arcana, A Visual History of D&D, which I'm extremely proud to have on the shelf behind me in all my meetings. So that's not actually just for this. That's what I do all the time. Today we're going to start our discussion with the authors and then move on to Q&A. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the YouTube chat, and we will bring them up for the authors. With that out of the way, I wanted to lead off with a question. I'll admit that the idea of a D&D cookbook kind of surprised me at first, especially with you all as such a notable lineup of authors. How did this project get started?
I'm happy to take a crack at that one. Sage, again, first of all, thank you for having us back. We are so thrilled to be talking to Google again, Googlers. We did do a talk a couple of years ago for Art and Arcana, which was a huge highlight of that tour. And of course, I've known you now for 5 or 6 years because you were not kind enough to have me in one of the Seattle offices for Empire of Imagination all those years ago. So thanks again. We were as surprised as you to actually have this concept come to our door. In a lot of ways, because this is something that happened really organically. Our publisher, which is Penguin Random House, for Art and Arcana was a group called 10 Speed. And we were just wrapping up that Art and Arcana project. It had gone really well. We were all super proud of it and excited, both the author team as well as the publisher. And the publisher came to us because he is in charge of a few different imprints under Penguin. One is called Clarkson Potter, which is known for a number of really, really wonderful cookbooks. A little series called Barefoot Contessa, for example, might be something you've heard of. So he's the publisher of these books. So he really, really knows cookbooks well, as does this whole group. And so he came to us and said, I've had this idea for a couple of years to do a really spectacular D&D cookbook that really helps you explore all these different things. So as an author team, of course, we love D&D, but this is not an area that we admittedly had studied very much in the past. But of course, we always crave, no pun intended, we crave the notion of exploring new elements and new angles of D&D. So we sat down with the publisher and with Wizards and really talked through, gosh, what can we do to make a cookbook that really enhances the D&D experience, right? It won't be good enough to do a cookbook and put a D&D logo on the front, right? That's a gimmick. We want to stay away from that. We want something that really kind of enhances this experience and gives you more knowledge about D&D, in this case, through the lens of food. So we, 10 Speed built this incredible team around us and just surrounded us with some of the most extraordinary people in the cookbook space, photographers, prop people, a long list, and worked closely with Wizards. And that's really how this came about. We were just thrilled to be part of it, and we're really, really proud of what we put together.
Yeah, that's amazing, and the book itself is actually really beautiful. I understand that you might have had some original art done for that. What was the process of coming up with a visual look for a book of recipes set in D&D?
It was kind of an awesome responsibility in some ways, because there's been a lot of D&D art and Arcana, the book we did previously, obviously explores the entire history of the brand, from the kind of crudest things that were done in the first versions of the game up to where we are today with the amazing art we see in 5th edition D&D. And, but the idea that we would have to bring this to life, not just with art, but also with photography that was set in the D&D universe, and that we would be able to show people in a properly staged way how this food might appear in this tavern or in this particular. We even go through a few kind of signature restaurants that we think are interesting from the D&D multiverse. And so, yeah, I mean, we recruited an incredible team of photographers, prop experts. We had a blast, I can tell you, doing the photography component of this. We were all in LA, and the best part of being there for the food photography is, of course, you get to eat some of the food afterwards. It's done by professional food stylists, and so that part was a lot of fun. And when it came to doing the original artwork itself, you know, when you go back through the D&D books, you see the occasional pictures of taverns and things like that as settings historically in D&D through the ages. But we really wanted to be able to capture these fantasy cultures in particular in their, you know, their homelands, in their homes themselves in some instances. And so we kind of went through, well, how do we want to make the elves look as they're preparing food? How do we want to make, you know, the halflings look as they're in their shire or what have you? And like kind of assembling all that, you know, was a really engaging, I think, process for all of us, working with our people that 10 Speed Press connected us with in order to be able to really give us a view of what the lives of these people might be like when it comes time to sit down and have something to eat.
Yeah, I love these illustrations. They're just amazing, and they really set a tone for the kind of diverse ways that people might interact with food in a fantasy world. Were there any like real world inspirations for how some of these different cultures shine through in the food, or how did you bring that diversity into play?
I think for us, and thank you again for the intro, and thank you for having us back.
No problem.
I think for us, first and foremost, we wanted to explore what had come before and be reverential to everything in D&D's history, be it what's been published in actual game modules or novels, comic books, things that have been referenced in other compendiums, things from Dragon Magazine. We want to explore everything, and that's where the research expertise of people like Jon come in, and Michael, and we put our heads together and we make a macro list of where to explore. And then we explore, and then we aggregate, and then everything went through a testing process in terms of balanced menus, representation of the varied cultures. And then within that, it's balancing menus and also to make each selection as eclectic as possible. So we're touching a little bit of everything. And then from there, we started factoring in, obviously, benchmarks, palates, what humans in our world like to eat, and trying to find unique ways to invigorate that with combinations and pairings that sometimes might not be obvious, sometimes looking back into old European traditions, but obviously trying to pull from everything. And going into, you know, there's an old book called The Aurora's Guide, which really laid out costs and available products in different types of different regions, rareness, and lets us know what was available at the market or what was being harvested, what would make good ingredients for a pie, what food wasn't readily available, what's very exotic, you know, what's something normal for us might be considered exotic in Forgotten Realms. So all those things had to be factored in. So there was so many layers to making it that it's hard to say we borrowed distinctly from a single culture. The main goals were we wanted palatable, healthy, and something that inspired you to become immersive in the game, to bring this food to your tabletop. And those were like the primary benchmarks.
So I think those are great benchmarks, and like I'm kind of jealous of getting to eat the like prepared versions of all these. What are your favorites? I mean, I'm sure you've all gotten to try all these dishes, and probably a few that didn't make it. What are your favorite ones from the book?
Ooh, there's some good ones. You want to go first, Michael?
Yeah, I can start with there. I just actually shared. If you see me busy at work here, I'm trying to share some imagery to go along with what we're saying here. This is actually one of them for me, for sure. The Wood Elf Forest salad. It's just a gorgeous salad made with raw Brussels sprouts, and you use edible flowers in this particular case. So we've actually recommended this for all kinds of different occasions. No, my single favorite dish in the book is one called dragon salmon, which is a half elven dish from Eberron, if memory serves, and it's just absolutely extraordinary. And you know, I happen to love salmon, and the real testament to this one is when I made it, when we were actually testing all of these during the development process. My mother-in-law was in town, and she is from the Pacific Northwest, actually your neck of the woods, Sage, and she knows salmon really well, and she's a wonderful cook. And I remember after I made it, there wasn't much discussion other than she asked me for the recipe, which I knew she would not have done if she didn't think it was something special. So dragon salmon is probably my single favorite thing. But I will say in a general sense, for me, a lot of the lighter fare is actually some of my favorite stuff. Everything in the elven section is I absolutely just adore. But I actually might say the same thing about the halfling section, which is actually a lot more decadent. And that's kind of how we compartmentalize these different dishes. So it was really, really a lot of fun.
I myself, I was a fan of things like the Ved bread. That came out, I think, quite well. Another Eberron style dish there. Certainly think, there's a mushroom tea that is kind of based on a traditional Japanese autumn preparation that I happen to be a fan of. And we tried to make this to kind of draw for our cultural influences on what materials we thought would be available to these fantasy cultures and kind of what corollaries for that would be. And so a lot of the drow dishes actually are things I really like. They're like mushroom heavy, based on, it's almost like Nordic foraged, except in caves kind of style. And so, and I like drinks. I do favor cocktails now and again. And actually, in one of the talks we gave for this, I had to make a drink called the Mind Flayer kind of live as we did this in an interview, and then drink it. That interview was a lot of fun, actually, after I made it. And
I was about to ask, did it get more fun after the drink or not? But
I mean, it's basically a vodka slushy. So yes.
Kyle, any favorites?
Like Michael, dragon salmon's really delicious. Early on in the pandemic, I was staying with some relatives in Pennsylvania, and I got to re-explore some of them. The hand pies were a big hit. The stew is pretty delectable. This holiday season, I cooked up the ham with the pineapple gravy. That was great. I think I like the egg battered stuffed toast. It's kind of like a French toast, but it's stuffed with like a marmalade syrup drizzle on top. It's pretty decadent. The cream puffs are great. Let's see. I guess the something vegetarian. See, John leans more into the mushrooms. I'm an anti-mushroom guy. That's where we complement pretty well. There's the Quallen SD vegetable stew, which is beautiful and relatively easy to make and affordable, and I think it's pretty delicious. It's hard to go. There's so many unique ones here. It's kind of like what's your meal and where your taste buds at. But I think if you were to open up the book and dive right in, you probably can't go wrong with the dragon salmon, like Michael suggested.
Despite living in the Pacific Northwest, I've never been that big a fan of salmon. So I'm going to have to try that now.
Me neither. And I'm like, I like salmon now. Okay.
Yeah, I moved here from the Southwest, and fresh fish was not really something we got a lot. So it took me a while to kind of get used to having fish around all the time. And now maybe I'll give it a try.
Well, I'll say this, Sage, the sauce makes the salmon in this case. My recollection is it's like a butter shallot sauce. That's the one you won't forget. So it's worth a try.
I mean, butter and shallots, I'll put that on anything pretty much. Were there any concepts that didn't make it into the book that you, for whatever reason, just didn't fit in? Recipes that you really wished could work?
I mean, one thing I will say is that we tried to make these dishes very accessible. Things that you should be able to go to a reasonable supermarket and be able to find the ingredients. I mean, obviously, if you read especially the novels, if you're going through like Bob Salvatore's novels and things like that, you'll see a lot of references to people eating venison and rabbit, and there's kind of a lot of exotic meats like that on balance just seemed like they might be too difficult for people to secure. Who knows, if someday we were to do a sequel to this book, it's certainly very possible some of those more exotic options might come into it. No idea that something might happen. You never know.
Yeah. Sage, with regard to the development of the final book, right? It's one of those situations where you definitely find yourself in a situation where you certainly don't just sit there and scour everything you can out of the 45 years of D&D history. You do that first. That was the first most obvious thing to do. The notion of here's a good example. You have to include Oddix spice fried potatoes, right? You have to if you look at this literature, and that's one of the most recognizable single dishes in all D&D lore, which of course is a pretty unique lore, right? This notion that most of D&D lore is actually do-it-yourself stuff, right? There isn't a single kind of narrative line that everyone agrees on in D&D, right? It's all about whatever you happen to like and what you play. There are, of course, novels, and there are, of course, adventures that a lot of people have played that have some of this stuff in them. So the first thing you do is you kind of take all that stuff. And then, as Jon mentioned earlier, you really try to define the different cultures, their palates, their ingredients, their preferences. And once you've done that, then you can extrapolate a little bit, which I think became a really important part of how we developed this. But at the end of the day, once you've done all that work, you start looking at a book that might be very heavy on desserts or might be very heavy on stews. And all of a sudden you realize, well, I need a balanced book as well. So let's look a little further. Let's dig a little deeper and see where else we can look geographically, worldwise, or otherwise to figure out where we can go to find a book that's gonna balance the way a really good cookbook should. And again, that was one of the huge strengths of 10-Speed as well, is they could help us curate those things and help us figure out how to balance these different elements to make sure that it's not just a fun D&D fantasy book, it's also a good cookbook independently of being a D&D cookbook.
And there were some ingredients which were too exotic, like manticore meat, things like that. So we were able to pay homage or reference them in the various menus of the inns. Sometimes in our headers, we could talk about a spice that was perhaps too exotic, like a tiefling spice that would maybe be damaging to the senses of an ordinary man. So we can we were able to drop those ideas in there, things that they're part of the multiverse, but just didn't make sense on a practical menu. We definitely had about 140, 150 good ideas before we whittled it down to nearly half that. And I think it was hard sometimes. There was like maybe we did have one too many breads, or obviously the menus in a lot of these inns, their soup, their roast, their stew, and bread and cheese heavy. So we didn't want to burden everybody with that. Sometimes we needed more vegetarian options and more drinks and things like that. So there were some hard cuts along the way, but I think each time it's collectively vetted. And there is room to grow, which is what's exciting, because we're not just exploring the Forgotten Realms, we're exploring Eberron and Kryn and Oerth from Greyhawk. So there was a wealth of information, and it's great because food is something that's intrinsically part of your tabletop game. When you get together for 6 hours, food's right there. And in every D&D adventure, you're starting at an inn or tavern. So there's always some type of fascination and connection with food. So it was a strangely organic topic, going through all this.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, the idea does actually make a lot of sense. Yeah, I think I had the initial reaction that you all did to the kind of pitch, but it all works together, and the book itself is absolutely beautiful and amazing. I haven't cooked anything out of it, but it really is great. So I know, especially Jon and Michael, you're both like researchers and historians to some degree. Did you learn anything new through the research process for this book that you hadn't already encountered in your other research?
I think anytime you look, especially if you've studied D&D for many, many years, any new angle is attractive. Anything that's like, okay, I didn't really, like we did in Art Arcana, I hadn't really looked at like the early artists before, and who were these people? You see their names, but like, do we know anything about them? Why'd they do this? How old were they when they did it? And so certainly going through a process like this, it requires you to take a very different look at the fantasy cultures and to think, I mean, in some respects, to innovate, right? I mean, we had this awesome responsibility to be able to maybe just fill in a little tiny component, not something that will have like a game mechanic sort of effect on how you play D&D, but something that hopefully will enrich the way that people interact with these characters when they play them. And, I mean, the research task, from my perspective, I mean, I was mining ancient modules, mining, the original novels and things like it, and identifying all the places where food interacted with it. Was often trying to figure out, well, okay, how can we find, we, like, for example, we knew we wanted to do, a vegetarian burger sort of thing, like an Impossible burger sort of thing. And like, we mined the D&D lore for where you could possibly find something like that. And the answer we came up with ultimately was from the Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, which was one of the original old school modules that is, predicated on this spaceship, right? Having crashed into Greyhawk, and you can explore it like it's a dungeon, it's a multi-level thing. But there are descriptions of the pantries on this, straight out of sci-fi ship that nevertheless got integrated into D&D lore. And there's a mention in that, just an offhand thing that said surrogate steaks. So what are surrogate steaks really? And we just get to say, well, actually, surrogate steaks are more or less like, an Impossible Burger, like some kind of a meat substitute sort of thing, and make up a little story about it. And so in that sense, yeah, looking through this, I'm not sure I would have really paid attention to the pantries in the crash spaceship in the expedition to the Barrier Peaks previously. So this just makes you, you shine. It's what is it? Carl Sagan, who said that, the light of science, you shine it anywhere, you shine it everywhere. And so shining it in these kind of obscure corners, it lets us illuminate the D&D world a bit.
Well, and that's probably the least broken thing to come out of Barrier Peaks. So congratulations on adding something from that actually, works with everything else.
Well, and speaking of obscure and heady stuff, hey, Jon, I pulled this up for that very reason in terms of what might come out of your real world research about the brand and the company, and then how that might interact with this. Jon, do you want to talk about this one a little bit, this orc bacon?
Yeah, this is one of the stranger stories in D&D's kind of fad moment of the early 1980s when they were licensing D&D for beach towels, wallets, party sets. Everything had, D&D trade dress and the kind of Marvel aligned characters, the Kellex and so on from, they were kind of adjacent to the cartoon series they were doing. At around this time, apparently, TSR, which was then the company that made D&D, licensed to Oscar Mayer the right to sell D&D branded meat products only in Europe. And so, we see this in Spain, that they had these kind of Oscar Mayer. You could buy, hot dogs, all these things, but including bacon strips. And TSR staff at the time was delighted by this. They thought this was just the most amazing irony that they would have licensed D&D for meat products. And so they started internally talking about it as orc bacon. And actually, even in TSR's corporate 20th history, they produced internally, when they list the different licenses, the license to Oscar Mayer for there is listed as for orc bacon. So I at least was determined to find a way to get orc bacon into this book. And the answer we came up to that, of course, was that this would be a half-orc recipe, actually, that, there's a version of it that adventurers could use to distract orcs pursuing them in the underworld. If you've got a huge party tracking you might drop some of this. But then there's a version that's kind of more palatable for humans overall that we describe here, that we hope is nummy.
That, by the way, is actually a tremendous dish. It's a brown sugar and garlic glaze, which doesn't by itself maybe sound particularly appetizing, but I promise it is. It's like a really spectacular. If you want to have a really decadent breakfast, orc bacon is actually a really, really, really good dish. And just to append something that Jon said, from my perspective at least, was, yeah, research is research. Whether you happen to be researching novels, in other words, researching fictional material, or researching real nonfiction stuff, research is research. You get your nose in it. You really kind of turn over every rock you can. And we approach this project with the same rigor as we would any other nonfiction project. And in fact, as a bigger kind of mission, you might say, with regard to what we were trying to accomplish, was we didn't think of let's do a D&D cookbook. What we thought is, let's do a D&D source book that happens to shine a light on food. So in other words, let's make this as detailed and as informational as any other D&D source book they might produce at Wizards of the Coast today. But this one happens to be everything is through the lens of food, and it has recipes and other things. And so in that respect, I think people that see this will at least appreciate the idea that it really does align with the brand, with what they would be used to in seeing a source book, because it has a lot of source book information. It's just, instead of spells and classes, it's like on what halflings usually grow in their farms and things like that. So it was a really fun process in that respect, and research was a huge part of it.
Yeah, I appreciate and actually all of your work, art and arcana, and history of Empire of Imagination. Sorry, and Planet the World. The degree of research that is there, and it was kind of fun to see that shine through in a cookbook of all things. So especially something that John has pointed out is the number of influences that flow into D&D in the early days. And here I'm thinking of things, other fictional things that have their takes on food. Tolkien and Lembas bread and all that stuff. Did any of those influences that kind of flow through into D&D show up directly in the cookbook in some way, or were your main sources all kind of like primary D&D texts?
I think we tried to stay primarily D&D to go as immersive in universe. Obviously, it's hard to separate talk of halflings from hobbits. We know their origins, and certain things originated out of Tolkien and inspirations. But we did try to stay everything within the universe. I don't think we deviated really from that.
But we certainly, living in the world we do, we certainly, you can't ignore these influences. And so, to your point, I can think of a picture that we did. Again, this is a little bit wink and nod type of stuff, but one of the photographs, which of course we were able to attend the session, I don't remember what dish it was off the top of my head, but it's a halfling dish. And I remember Kyle put his ring next to the dish, right? Like it's a little thing, and you'd never notice it unless you're looking for it. But it's little things like that you want to kind of tie all this stuff together and make sure that anybody that loves fantasy in general would enjoy this book as well, even if they don't play D&D. And I think it does have that level of different levels.
And just thinking about, I remember Mike, you were posing questions to us when we were researching this, like, just think about what it is to be like an elf and to live for as long as you do, and like how does that make you think about food differently than the way humans do? And we kind of came away with this impression that like humans were hasty, humans were busy, they had a lot to do, and like they looked at food through the lens of well, I got to get this done and keep move on to the next thing. Whereas for dwarves we looked at what could you eat while you're working? If you're extremely industrious and you've got your forge, and what can you keep warm on a skillet on top of the very forge you're using to smith something, right? And like, kind of eat, but then immediately get back to work. And I mean, certainly so many different fantasy source literatures, right? Going back to like the Eddas and the sagas, right? Going back to the things that Tolkien himself was drawing on, helped to paint the picture of how these fantasy cultures operated.
Yeah, John, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was probably, you probably know this, one of my favorite parts of the project, this notion of extrapolating exactly as you said. An elf in D&D lives 700 years if they're not killed by something else, like a fireball, for example. But so if you think about that, again, we really did try to like think in those terms, like, well, what would that mean to someone who cooks? You wouldn't actually mind braising something for a few days if the food would hold up, or you may not, right? Like you can take more time with things. There was all kinds, and even if you consider the idea that like food was one of the things that connects these creatures to mortality, right? Like consider this is a creature, they're not immortal, but they're way more immortal than we are, right? And so again, it's just the idea of looking through those lenses and trying to figure out what strands you can pull to make this a meaningful book that tells you about what these cultures are really interested in from a food perspective.
Yeah, what's in their larder, how they source it, their philosophies on killing an animal. Like elves are much more conscious of the land, and they're going to recycle every part of an animal, and they're probably not going to get into the beef and things like that. A half elf might blend or blur some of those distinctions. Humans, they're much more, livestock's more accessible as opposed to, say, dwarves who live underground. So, and then there's the ceremony that's involved in it, beyond it, the ritual of food, which we also wanted to stratify in this and explore and as it pertains to the different worlds and realms. And there might be more ceremony tied to it for a dwarf than there is, say, for a halfling. It's more about entertaining, and it's more about using what you can grow in your own garden. Whereas elves, like you're just saying, they might age something. They might take the time to age something differently, or sauce. They might take much more time preparing it. And humans are more hasty, and they're more expansive, more about expansion, and they're also more adaptable to different regions, which means the topography and what's available to them is different, and therefore their palate is probably much more diverse in terms of what a human menu can encompass. So all those things were factored in, and we did try to structure it like a player's handbook in terms of how we delineated the information and presented it. And there were these great books back in the day, like the Book of the Dwarf and the Halfling book, and they would get into, just like on a more cultural level, also how they approached warfare. And we said, well, why not just apply that to something as intrinsic and important as food and ceremony?
Yeah, and I think that attention to how these cultures would work really shows through in the kind of diverse approaches to recipes in the book, and I personally really appreciate it. Just a reminder to the folks in chat, we will take questions for the authors from chat. So if you have any, please drop them in before we move on to those. But I'm going to give you all one more question of mine before we move on to audience questions. So you mentioned getting to work with chefs to develop these recipes and then getting to see them, professionally prepared and styled for the photo shoot. Did you learn anything about cooking through this? We've talked a lot about what you learned about D&D because that's kind of my main passion, but I like cooking a lot too. What did you learn about cooking?
Well, Mike is our champion in terms of number of dishes in this made. Exactly how many recipes have you personally made, Mike?
No, I've made about 70 out of the 80 dishes in the book. I was absolutely a level 1 chef at best when I started. Now I'm level 2. I think I got like 1,000 experience out of the whole. No, I mean, again, I'm not going to pretend like I'm a great chef in any respect. But I did feel very strongly that I wanted to really learn and I wanted to understand things about these dishes in different ways. We all did. Whether it was tasting dishes prepared by the professional stylists and chefs at the photography sessions or working directly with the chef they got to do this project, which I cannot say enough about. Adam Reed, who works with America's Test Kitchen. He did just such an extraordinary job of taking concepts that we would give him. So consider the flow of recipe development. The way it would work was that we were responsible for coming up with what the dish was. That might come directly from text, where we could actually excerpt text for him directly and say, here's what it is and here's what it's like. And and by the way, this culture thinks about this and that. Or it might be something a little bit further afield, where we would actually write out the head note, probably more often than not. We'd actually, those little descriptions that are atop every recipe, we would write those ahead of time and send them on to him. And it would give him more places to go and more inspiration, where he could draw things and say, oh, I see they mentioned this here. It may have been ancillary text in our little head note, but he could take something from it and do something with it. And then inevitably what would happen, which is a real testament to kind of how collaborative the project was, a lot of times those would come back and we would realize, oh goodness, we forgot to mention this or that about elves or halflings. And all of a sudden we actually had to rethink the dish, and we had to tell this professional chef who knows 20 times more about this, 1,000 times more about this than any of us. Gosh, I'm sorry about this, but this can't work because of X, Y, and Z. So it was such a cool project. And, I think everyone here, we all love learning new things. And this for me was such a stretch, both with cooking and just having to look through new lenses, which I think is such a valuable thing for anybody. So, yeah.
It gets you thinking about community and preparing food for a group. I would always cook for my D&D groups when they come over. It was just part of it. People would come to the house and I'd have something different, and I would use them as guinea pigs and test. And it's fortuitous that the book came about when it did this year, considering the pandemic and so many people are eating at home. People were probably burned out of ordering food, and you're cooking for a group, oftentimes just not yourself, with who you're with in the home. And I think it's a great entry point, like Michael said, too. If you have a fascination with cooking, you want to get into it, why not tether it to something you love, like Dungeons and Dragons or fantasy, and explore that and develop this really good, personal trait. The cooking is such a vital thing, and cooking for yourself, cooking for a group, there's something rewarding about it. So I think the timing of it all, and also the idea of community, that D&D groups are a community, and pick up a new skill like you do that in Dungeons and Dragons, and work your way through the book. And I think there's something rewarding about that. That's what I've been also doing, is remaking some of these and learning about balancing menus and preparing for groups, and it's cool.
And we have just been so overwhelmed by the reception of the community. Just to Kyle's point about, it's fortuitous timing. I mean, it's really gratifying to be able to work on something like this that is connected with so many people in what is an incredibly difficult time. And just to see people on social media who are cooking their way through it, who, develop the most elaborate plating and lighting and everything to photograph these things for Insta. And it's, it's really been, as I said, it's been a real pleasure for us to see that.
There's a great group on Facebook, and I was going through it the other day, and I think I told Michael, but they were talking about how they were getting peacock meat to like do a variation on one of our dishes where we suggested peacock, and there was a whole conversation about where they're sourcing their peacock meat and recommending it. And they were like, they're posting variations, and people are saying, you know, try this and try that. And that's one thing we encourage as Dungeons and Dragons is you homebrew it. You take this set of rules and you make it work for your table. And there's no reason why that can't be applicable with a cookbook the same way. So if your palate is a little bit different or you want to try something different, we totally encourage that. And if you want to gamify it and roll a dice and randomize, you can do that too. But I think that's in the spirit of the book is customization and trying it in a different way next time. That's the way I cook too. I don't really go by recipes. I always do by taste. Each time it's just a little bit different. So I like that.
Now, and for the record, the head notes, of course, are written in world. So we don't expect anybody to source Manticore or Tiefling Fire Spice. These are not things we actually expect you to go get. We do want you to follow the recipes that the real, a real outstanding chef went ahead and developed for you. But yeah, again, there is, there's a randomization element. Again, this is another one of those gamification elements we did talk about when we were building the book. This notion of, again, how do we really enhance the tabletop experience? And we put together a piece at the very end, actually, that recommends some ideas about how you can take these gamification elements to the table. For example, I think we recommend that you can roll a D4 to select your protein for a particular dish. It's things like that, again, we really want this to tie into a real social experience that also involves playing D&D. So hopefully we accomplish that.
I mean, from my point of view, you certainly did. So let's go ahead and take some questions from the folks watching here, which I believe will, appear here with fancy pictures. Hey, Jen. I work with Jen, so I know her in particular. Can you tell me more about the gorgeous visuals? I think Jen actually also mentioned that I kind of asked the same question, but anything else you'd like to say about the gorgeous visuals?
Well, a big thing on a macro level was we knew we were going to get these beautiful detailed shots, food photography. And I think to make it, to open it up a bit, we didn't just want to have artistic representations more of food. That's when we started this process of saying, well, how can we make it like a palate cleanser? Each time you get to a new section, we get to halflings and we open it up, and now we're in the harvest. And what does that look like in the world of halflings? Or you get to dwarves and we're subterranean. And so the artwork intersected with it in a way to complement and provide a new angle into the world, because we knew we just had rich food photography. So trying to find that balance, and that's where I think we did find a nice balance between having some original work commissioned alongside nice close-ups of sizzling meats and fresh vegetables.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate we couldn't we can take pictures of the food, but we really can't take pictures of elves and halflings. And so, in order to have them and to show their culture, we needed to go back to the roots, back to doing art. And so it really was just us trying to make sure that those cultures and, their context came to life. And, we're obviously very grateful to the people the 10 Speed Press connected us up with to be able to generate original new D&D art, which is always something we like being able to have a hand in creating.
Yeah, and one other thing about the visuals that, again, we were so humbled by was this notion that, so you may have just saw that I was sharing a picture. There was a dragon orb there, if anyone knows what a dragon orb is. One area that we were so grateful to work with, like, really, really spectacular Hollywood level photographers and prop people. And one of the things that we thought would be really important for the purpose of authenticity is let's not go generic fantasy. Let's be really specific about D&D. One thing you'll notice in this book, and I was trying to show some examples there. I think I failed on my second one. But all the coins in the book, or virtually all the coins in the book, they're D&D made coins. They're actually D&D props. They're gold dragons from Waterdeep. We happen to have a lot of friends, Matthew Lillard being one of them, who runs a company, the actor, who runs a company called Beetle and Grimm, who makes all these little props that we were able to utilize for photo shoots, for the photo shoot for authenticity. We also, we had a bunch of D&D magical items made, 3D printed for us and painted for us, like that dragon orb. You'll see the Talisman of Ultimate Evil in there somewhere. You'll see the Talisman of the Sphere. these iconic things that you can page through your 5th edition D&D books. You will find illustrated representations of these things. We had them made. And so that was another area that, again, not something we had to do. And a lot of times they're kind of just in the background, right? The food is the star of the show. We know this. But it also was important to us that anybody that really plays this game and loves it the way we do might really appreciate the idea of that level of detail and authenticity versus just kind of saying, oh, look, it's just generic fantasy, old style medieval tavern or this or that. Like, we really, if you look at the details, they're really there. And that was very important to us.
Yeah,
and
beautiful artifacts. Oh, sorry. Go on, John.
I was just going to say those artifacts do work as well. So if you see us on the street, we can show you the talisman of both medieval. Yeah.
Like John brought some of his weapons. Michael brought some weapons. Justin Goby Fields, he created 4 original props. Like you said, Beelan Grimm's Matthew Lillard, Death Staves, and Joe Manganiello contributed a few magical items. Our friends at Dwarven Forge had some great coinage. It was sourcing the community because obviously we couldn't just go get everything made from scratch, but thankfully, there are these wonderful companies and artisans that already made this stuff that we could then populate. And like you said, not center on it, but if you can have like, dice of chance over there and some coinage and a knife on the table, and suddenly a little beer is spilled, you feel like, okay, I'm at this gambling table and they've just served this. And that type of immersion is what we just want to inspire in your game. And I think that was also the most fun for us, is like, what little accents can we do which can let us know we might be in Eberron versus we're at a table in Kryn. And if you know, and if you don't, it just feels authentic.
Great. Let's go ahead and take another audience question. Jen also asks, plans for expanding into different worlds, Barovian delectables, flavors of the Forgotten Realms, edibles of Eberron.
Barovia in there, and an expansion, check. Yes, there are some good plans for that. Also, there's so many holidays which are relatable and germane to our holidays and our calendar. And D&D, much like Christians and pagans borrowed, and I think there's room to do that too, to explore all these big events that are on a D&D calendar. We would love to do more, because I think we got so excited about this project and the potential. And one of the harder parts was obviously the editing, whittling down and having to kill some of those things and mothball them for potential later. So Barovia is so much. I mean, it's distinct, and anytime you get like a real rich sense of a place, it stimulates those visuals. You can also get a sense of the food and the life, and I think there's room to then go deep dive and explore that.
And by the way, I have to. Oh, I'm sorry, John. Please.
No, you go. We're gonna make the same joke. You can make it.
Oh no, I appreciated that Jen has clearly played Curse of Strahd. She mentioned meat pies specifically, which are not the kind of meat pies you want to eat. I'm going to tell you right now, you don't want to know. This is like a Soylent Green moment. That you don't want to know what's going on in Barovia. This is, of course, the home of Strahd the Vampire, Barovia being a kind of Transylvania type setting. So that was a great question, Jen. I appreciated that.
And yes, we were going to make the same joke. It was just a question which of us delivered it. Your delivery is probably better than mine, so yes.
No, I've got nothing on delivery.
Well, great. Let's go ahead and take another. So Alex asks, you've talked a lot about D&D races as inspiration for these recipes, but did the classes inform any of the recipes at all?
Heroes Feast.
Question.
The spell. I mean, it comes off. It's steeped in history and lore. The spell itself, it informs the title, and not every class of caster can perform a Heroes Feast. So just little things like that. Yeah, you have to have an awareness of who could prep a Hero's Feast. And that's something that enhances everyone's ability going into battle, granting you temporary hit points and fear immunities and all these bonuses. I would say heavy class work, though, like a Goodberry smoothie. That's something that's more strictly Druid. They have access to that spell. It's very unique to them and specific to them. So we did give it a pass through, looking at eclecticness in terms of what's being represented. Rangers are being represented, wizards in terms of teas and things like that. So, and obviously some of these fantasy cultures are more typically tied to certain playable classes. And so that, I think, factors in a little bit. not as specifically, but definitely you always hear about halflings and rogues and things like that. So there's definitely references to the classes in both titling and in substance.
And we do pull out particular characters as well, right? And so, I mean, Kyle was talking about Joe Manganiello earlier. He has his own signature dish in there, his Arkin's flame grilled halflings, right? That he turns into a chili. So, I mean, yeah. So there are a couple of hooks like that that are more on the specific side. Persalian tea is maybe another one I'd point to like that.
And the Heroes Feast, one thing, just to piggyback on that, one of our original prompting questions, going back to the kind of the geeky research, how to get our head in the project, one of our prompting questions when we started was, when a spellcaster casts Heroes Feast, which I think is typically cleric and druid, at least in 5th edition, is it always the same? Is the Heroes Feast they cast always the same, or is it actually based somehow on the tastes and preferences of the caster themselves? It was one of our, again, and it was that type of thinking. And again, we never came to a necessarily particularly conclusive answer. We do have some recommendations and ideas, but again, it was the kind of thinking we thought was appropriate to really try to get our heads right in the D&D world.
Like a lizard folk cleric casting this meal would probably have very different proteins than a human cleric versus a tabaxi cleric and their palate. So it's funny, we had to have all these conversations late at night, like really delineating like what are the foods of say a lizard person, and how do you represent that. Obviously, things like insects and stuff like that we didn't get into, but probably a popular source of protein, grubs and subterranean things. And
wait, don't give away the next book, Kyle.
I was just wondering, you keep on
All
kind of alluding
insects.
to potential future books. Are we going to get an all insect one? I think we have time for a couple more questions here. And I know there was several, so let's go ahead. Katie asks, Katie, sorry, I'm not sure if I got your name right. What clues did you find to help you decide which cultures have a sweet tooth?
Well, halflings are pretty low-hanging fruit. Going back now to your earlier question about pulling in what we know more broadly about fantasy cultures, right? I mean, you can't read any of the Lord of the Rings literature or watch the movies without, in this case, hobbits talking incessantly about sweets and foods and potatoes and this and that. So, I mean, again, there was some low-hanging fruit there that there's just actually a lot of literature that really, really points you in certain places for certain cultures. But it's a really good question, because it's not the easiest thing to find. I mean, you can find little tidbits of information here or there throughout D&D lore. But I mean, again, if you think about functionally how often a module really needs to outline specific foods, it's just not that often, right? So it was a big fact-finding mission, for sure.
It usually gets into it when you're about to be poisoned. I think also, just on a bigger sense, you say dwarves, or say what would use to sweeten it? Probably fruits or berries and stuff. And does a dwarf have access to that? And you start to realize that the way their culture's been represented in various movies and in Dungeons and Dragons, it's this thought process almost just gets breathed into it just because of the logic behind it. You're underground or subterranean. You're probably not gonna be able to grow those things or have those things, whereas halflings might be much more readily available, since they've got their gardens in their backyard and they're going to go out and pick their berries fresh. Same thing with elves, and we get into this nice eaten mess type dish, which was what's the title we ended up with our berries and cream?
Meal's End.
Meal's End, yeah, which is obviously you got to have access to a light, fresh dairy to whip, and fresh berries, and that's just who would have access to that. So that it definitely informs the degree of sweetness and things like that.
Great. So Jessica asks, when it comes to bakery, did you have any recipes that came up first that might be good starter recipes, initiative rolls, perhaps? I kind of want to give a round of applause just for the joke, but anything that makes a good starter recipe?
Biscuits.
I was going to say the same, actually. Yeah, the yawning. Yawning Portal, Tavern Biscuits.
Like a trail mix, something you could eat on the go, which is its intention. We tried to have iron rations for each culture too. At least it was our initial intention was let's have each of the major cultures have some type of trail mix or iron rations or something sustainable and non-perishable. That's something else we'd probably explore further. But yeah, there are really great breads in here. So I will say if you want to start with breads or breakfast, depending on where you're starting your meal or you're starting your day. So we did want to put breakfasts in here. We did want to put things in here for solo adventures. Like it's not everything has to be a feast, but what's an easy thing you can do on your own? It doesn't require a lot of cleanup. But those Yawning Portal biscuits are pretty delicious.
Yeah, most of the baked goods in the book don't require quite as much precision as a lot of baking. And as a pretty novice baker myself, having gone through these, I could say I was usually successful. Not always, but usually successful. So things like elven bread, which is kind of based on lembas bread, right? Which is actually a cinnamon swirl bread in our case that actually comes from old Forgotten Realms 2nd edition material. Dishes like that. There's a bread called a cherry bread, which is actually a relatively simple kind of a fruit cake dish is actually what it is.
Yeah.
So again, I would say most of the baking in the book is relatively simple. If I could do it, I promise you could do it. Let's put it that way.
I got to say, I appreciate that. We like a lot of people ended up doing some home baking during the pandemic, with fancy classes from a local restaurant, and it did not go well. So I appreciate baking that even my household might be able to pull off. Well, I think we can actually fit in one more question if you all are good for that, and then we'll wrap it up. Awesome. Let's see if one more question appears. I think there was more in the chat. Yeah, there we go. Sloan asks, this has inspired me to host a D&D inspired theme dinner. I'll absolutely use your cookbook as a guide. Do you have any suggestions for creating an immersive experience in addition to the food?
Well, I mean, one of the great things I like to say about D&D is it takes place in a conversation, and you can have a conversation over dinner. Anytime you don't need the dice and the character sheets to be able to play through a scenario, you can always bring people into a game that way. And of course, you can always dress up. You can choose cutlery and plates and cups that look appropriate to the setting. You can find tablecloths or whatever that give you that rustic feeling of whether it's a tavern or whether you're in the Celestial Vista of Eberron, kind of whatever it is you really want to go for. Obviously, plating and lighting are big ways to make it all more immersive. Having people show up in suits of armor, that works too. Full plate, I recommend, like with the helmets and the visors and so on. But I mean, there's just so many ways to integrate the spirit of D&D into the communal experience of eating, I guess is the point. Because there's so much in common between sitting down around a tabletop with your friends to play and sitting down around a tabletop with your friends to eat. They kind of blend into each other seamlessly. You can always go from eating to the game, from the game to eating, game, eat, game. That's how we used to do it a lot when I was a kid. And so...
in addition to everything John said, my add to this would be, I'd recommend if you're going to serve these dishes to read the head note when you serve them, when you plate them. So the head note is there to make them more immersive. They're to tell you about them from an in-world perspective in the D&D realm. So I think that will add something to it. Truly, if when you serve these to somebody, you might actually stand there like a sommelier or a fancy restaurant waiter and actually read this head note and explain exactly what it is they're about to eat. I think that certainly is a good start to getting somebody's head into what they're about to experience.
There's something romantic about fantasy and the immersion, and I would go look at the lighting, fire, candle. You could start there, turn off your overhead lights and get rid of the fluorescence and the LEDs and traditional lighting. And simple things like we had to do, which was just like you change the tablecloth for a photo and you change the cutlery and what do your candlesticks look like and your plateware, and all this stuff is easily findable at, online. There's a couple of different sites. If you just Google in like fantasy wear, cookware, you can find stuff, eBay and garage sale, stuff like that. So if you really want to commit to it, you can build a little collection, your cupware for your teas, things like a halfling would have. Maybe we did some photos in there of what like a halfling's larder looks like, or their shelves and their wares and their pots and their stoneware. You can build a nice little collection cheaply to do that. But I think, a menu too doesn't hurt. We put these in-world menus in there, which you could then reference, benchmark, and then make your own, or print out, or customize it to where you are going to be, if you're making it for a group or you're making it for like a one-on-one. So I think the attention to detail is always the key in D&D. That helps let your mind translate it into something you can share experience. So I would apply those same techniques to this and go with just the minimal details is all you need.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle, John, and Michael, for joining us here. That was a lot of fun and made me very hungry because I have not had lunch yet. So unfortunately, I'm not going to cook anything from your book, but I'm definitely going to go and eat something. And thank you all so much for telling us about the book and for sharing all that awesome background on it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much to you, Sage, and to Google. We really appreciate your time today and your support. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Happy cooking.
Thanks for having us.